The first class I ever taught at this church was on this man and his writings, C.S. Lewis. This really closes the loop. We began in our apologetics study with his argument about why Jesus must be Lord, because he is neither a liar nor a lunatic. And it's one of the most well-known apologetic arguments out there. So it's only right that we end with him. He doesn't die as a martyr. His death in itself is not an apologetic, but a life that went from virulent atheism to the guy we study most to defend the Christian faith is really worth knowing. And there's the little guy. Isn't he cute? The first question on your quiz is going to be, what does CS stand for? It stands for Clive Staples Lewis. He was born in Belfast, Northern Ireland. His parents were English. His father was a lawyer and the first in the family, on his side of the family, to be a professional class person, compared to his mother's side, which had a long line of lawyers and clergy. She herself had college degrees in logic and mathematics. The thing you get out of Lewis's writings about his youth are that these were two very different people. Albert, the father, was prone to ups and downs. He could be melancholy, he could be on fire, passionate about something, he could be in the pits. And the best description he gives is with not much talent for happiness. That's not going to bode well for his relationship with his father, where he says his mother was of a cooler race. And by that he means much more stable, not prone to those ups and downs. She was his anchor. And there they are. There's Flora and there's Albert. He doesn't look like he's very happy, does he? They were members of the Church of Ireland, which is the Church of England, but it's in Ireland. And this book, Surprised by Joy, that I will make a couple of references to, is the one of three sort of autobiographical pieces that he wrote. If you want to know about his life from his perspective, not some other biographer's, this is the place to start. But he uses different names for some of the places. He changes the names to protect the innocent. But here he's talking about himself and says, I was taught the usual things, made to say my prayers, and in due time taken to church. I naturally accepted what I was told, but I cannot remember feeling much interest in it. Probably something many of us could say before we got to our teenage years. And this is a very important person in his life. His brother Warren, known as Warnie, who was 3 years older, he went into the military. C.S. Clive decided one day when he was a little boy that he liked the name of a dog that a friend, not his dog, Jack. And so he said, I want to be called Jack. And so he was for the rest of his life. People who knew him called him Jack. And he describes his relationship with his brother as they were close Confederates. They worked together on a lot of things up until the day he died. There's Warren and Jack in their youth and their bicycles. There they are as mature gentlemen. Warren had a problem with alcoholism, but he served as Jack's secretary till the very end. The last thing Lewis wrote was a response to a letter from a child. He responded to everything, and Warren did the writing, all up until the end. They lived together for many years as well. This is the house they moved to in 1905. He was born in 1898. It's a lovely house. It inspired some of what you read in his writings about big houses with hiding places. We shouldn't be surprised, it's called Little Lee, shouldn't be surprised that he grew up in an atmosphere heavy with books. There were books in the study, books in the dining room, books in the cloakroom, books too deep in the great bookcase on the landing, books in a bedroom, books piled as high as my shoulder in the cistern attic, books of all kinds. That was his environment growing up. He and Warren, when they were little, and I'm talking about 9, 10, Lewis wrote this. You can see C.S. Lewis and W.H. Lewis, Warren. They created an imaginary world like that of Beatrix Potter, but they called it Boxen. And there you can see the animal creatures who inhabited Boxen. In the writing that went with the pictures, he described Boxen's economic system, its political system, its geography, and its history. He's doing this when he's a kid. And this is where things start to go downhill. His mother died of cancer when he was 9 years old. With my mother's death, all settled happiness, all that was tranquil and reliable, remember that was his mother's personality, disappeared from my life. There was to be much fun, many pleasures, many stabs of joy, but no more of the old security. It was sea and islands now. The great continent had sunk like Atlantis. Very poetic and very heartbreaking. And in Surprised by Joy, here's what he says about his religious experience during this time. My mother's death was the occasion of what some, but not I, might regard as my first religious experience. When her case was pronounced hopeless, I remembered what I had been taught, that prayers offered in faith would be granted. I accordingly set myself to produce by willpower a firm belief that my prayers for her recovery would be successful, and as I thought, I achieved it. He got perfect prayers. When nevertheless she died, I shifted my ground and worked myself into a belief that there was to be a miracle. The interesting thing is that my disappointment produced no results beyond itself. The thing hadn't worked, but I was used to things not working, and I thought no more about it. This, when you read Surprised by Joy, which by the way, we are going to meet toward the end Joy Davidman, whom he marries. He had started this book with its title before he ever met her. It is not a reference to her. It is a reference to that joy he was talking about that he lost when his mom died. This feeling of peace and beauty. But he takes 6 chapters in Surprised by Joy to write about the trauma that he experienced in 4 public schools in England, which in Ireland and England. We know them as private schools here. His father, without the mom, needed him out of the house. He didn't sound like a guy that was going to take care of him, and he didn't. So he sends him off to school. Say 6 chapters in this book about the horrible experiences he had. And here was part of it. He was not athletic. And if you're at these schools, you're kicking a ball, you're whacking a ball, you're running, you're jumping. I had tried to like games and failed. That impulse had been left out of my makeup. I was to games, as the proverb has it, like an ass to the harp. That's his self-description. He wrote to his father constantly, he said, "Get me out of here." And at the first school, the father did move him after the headmaster was taken away to an insane asylum. He described it as a concentration camp. And you're really feeling sorry for the guy. And does it shock you that by age 13, he is a non-believer? He does go through confirmation because that's what you do, but he did not believe. And then the depth of his atheism and the sophistication of his atheism is enhanced. His father, after 4 horrible experiences, says, "All right, this isn't working out. I'm going to send you to a buddy, a friend who was my old headmaster, William Kirkpatrick, known as the Great Knock." and he became Lewis's private tutor. About the great Knock, Lewis says, "My debt to him is very great. My reverence to this day is undiminished." And this is a beautiful example of God taking things that are not good and making them into something good. Joseph being sold into slavery. You meant it for evil, God meant it for good. I'm here now in a position to save Israel. Good Friday, meant for evil, the death of the Son of God. God turns it into the most beautiful, significant thing that's ever happened with the resurrection. He turned it to good. Well, this guy is going to teach him the logic, the very detailed thinking to be able to explain what you mean and to explain it well. In fact, the story is when he gets off the train and Kirkpatrick meets him, he says, "What do you think of my town here?" He says, "Well, it's not as wild," it was in the countryside, "not as wild as I had thought." Kirkpatrick's response was, "What do you mean by wild, and why did you think it would be wild?" That was his introduction to Kirkpatrick. So Kirkpatrick teaches him Greek, Latin, and Italian literature. They read the great books. He teaches him to think, speak, and write logically, which is to our benefit to this day. And I love what he writes. I mean, this guy, despite his, he's too logical to be a Christian apparently, or thinks he is, but he does understand Lewis. He says, writes to his dad, "You may make a writer or scholar of him, but you'll not make anything else. You may make your mind up to that." So it's interesting that Kirkpatrick's logic and reasoning had led him to believe there was no God, and the tools he gave Lewis led him to believe that there is one. It's great stuff. Okay, this had a significant impact on Lewis. You can figure by his birth date, 1898, he's going to serve in the Great War. He begins his studies at Oxford in April of 17, but signs up with the military in September. He was wounded once and then sent back, but then in April of 1918, he was wounded in action, hospitalized in England, and his father ignores him, just as he did when he was writing about the horrors at the schools he was being made to go to. This, talk about heartbreaking, this is from a letter Lewis writes his dad. "Whenever I speak of you," he's talking about the other people in the hospital ward, "they all tease me and say they think my father is a myth of my imagination. No one believes that you exist. Please come. I am terribly homesick and long to see you. That is the top and bottom of it." He had a roommate in the barracks by the name of Patty Moore. And Patty Moore's mother, Janie, had been divorced or was in the process of it. He was going to be fatherless. Lewis was already motherless. And they made a deal. If one of us is killed in the war, which was a very distinct possibility, the other promises to look after the parent of the one who has been lost. And Patty Moore didn't make it. That's Patty, Lewis on the left, Patty Moore on the right. We don't know who's in the background. And that's Patty's mother, Janie. She did come to visit him in the hospital. And he did keep his promise. She lived with him, he with her, from 1920 until she died in 1951. If you are a Lewis aficionado, one of the great topics was there an intimate relationship between Mrs. Moore and Lewis? And the amateur psychiatrists among us will think, his mother meant everything to him. She died when he was 9. Here is a woman 27 years older. Maybe he's seeing some mother in her. And for a long time, people said, no, he did not have that kind of relationship. A recent review of documents that have become available show that he probably did. And that as one author put it,
They did what?
He was in a romantic relationship with Mrs. Moore. As one of them put it, look, the guy's 18, 19. He's been in the trenches. He's been this close to death. His father is absolutely ignoring him. Here is somebody who is showing him care and love. Guys at that age, hey, what do you expect? I don't think more or less of him. So this is the product of the First World War. The first thing that is published, it's in a book called Spirits in Bondage that he publishes under a pseudonym. And you'll see why he might not want the world to know who wrote. It's a collection of poems. He writes under the name Clive Hamilton. We know his real name, of course, is Clive. Hamilton was his mother's maiden name. So he writes under this pseudonym. And I need somebody to read this. I did this in my apologetics class, and one guy found it hard to read because he said, I'm not going to say those words. They're blasphemous. And they are, but does anybody mind reading them knowing that they're not your words? But listen, Jim, thank you.
Come, let us curse our master ere we die, for all our hopes in endless ruin lie. The good is dead, let us curse God most high. For 1,000 years of toil and hope and thought, wherein men labored upward and still wrought, new worlds and better thou hast made as naught. We built us joyful cities strong and fair. Knowledge we sought and gathered wisdom rare. And all this time you laughed upon our care. And suddenly the earth grew black with wrong. Our hope was crushed and silenced was our song. The heaven grew loud with weeping. Thou art strong.
We've got 2 more slides of this. That is Ypres in Belgium, which we have visited a couple of times. It's a beautiful town. It was a beautiful town. They've rebuilt it. That's what it looked like during the war. And I put that there because he said, the point here is humankind has done some great stuff. And now it's all in ruin and it's your fault. So whether he's saying there is no God or if there is one, he's not a good one, it's probably more the latter. Okay, Jim, crank it up.
Come then and curse the Lord. Over the earth gross darkness falls, and evil was our birth, and our few happy days of little worth. Even if it be not all a dream in vain, the ancient hope that still will rise again, of a just God that cares for earthly pain. Yet far away beyond our laboring night, he wanders in the depths of endless light, singing alone his musics of delight. Only the far-spent echo of his song, our dungeons and deep cells can smile along, and thou art nearer, thou art very strong.
This painting and the next are by the Nash brothers. This is, I think, one's Paul, one's John. They did great work on the Great War. That's what's left, that painting on the right. Go ahead, Jim.
O universal strength, I know it well. It is but froth of folly to rebel. But thou art Lord and hast the keys of hell. Yet I will not bow down to thee or love thee, for looking in my own heart I can prove thee, and know this frail, bruised being is above thee. Our love,
better than you, God. Go ahead.
our love, our hope, our thirsting for the right, our mercy and long seeking of the light. Shall we change these for thy relentless might? Laugh then and slay, shatter all things of worth, heap torment still on torment for thy mirth. Thou art not Lord while there are men on earth.
You must have loved this, God, watching people be slaughtered by machine guns, artillery, hung up on barbed wire, cities destroyed, gas used for the first time. You were having a ball. That's kind of what he's saying. It's going to get better, friends. He goes back to Oxford, and his specialty was not religion. It wasn't theology. He was an expert in English, particularly Middle Ages, medieval English. He was never a professor at Oxford. He was a lecturer and a tutor. You may know the system there is not so much going to classes as it is to meet with a tutor and learn. And he was a lecturer and tutor there for 30 years. One reason we think he was never made a professor there was professional jealousy. They were not selling books the way he was. That's still to come, but it was at a time when there was an opportunity for him to be a professor. But the Screwtape letters, Mere Christianity, he'd been on the radio, he was popular. So he moved into the kilns down there when I gave money to the C.S. Lewis Society to refurbish it. They now own it. I got this nice little painting. It looks very much like the picture, thank goodness. And you have Magdalen College, that is how it's pronounced, Magdalen College on the right, which is where he resided and taught, or where he taught. And then you have the kilns that he bought. It was actually in Mrs. Moore, Janie Moore. Remember the likely paramour, Moore? It was he and his brother, and she bought it. It was actually in her name. And her daughter also lived there. And he lived there till he died. So we've got to get on the right path, don't we, folks? And for someone who is trained to think logically and who values it highly, does it surprise you that he becomes a believer in God before he comes to accept the fullness of Christianity? Doesn't surprise me. And so this comes from Surprised by Joy, which was published in 1955. It started it much earlier. It's the one I've told you about, called The Shape of My Early Life. He says, the odd thing was that before God closed in on me, I was in fact offered what now appears a moment of wholly free choice. And these are images that anybody who's read much Lewis always knows. I was going up Headington Hill on the top of a bus, one of those English double-deckers. I became aware that I was holding something at bay or shutting something out. I felt myself being then and there given a free choice. I could open the door or keep it shut. I could unbuckle the armor or keep it on. I chose to open, to unbuckle, to loosen the rein. I felt as if I were a man of snow at long last beginning to melt. God, he's saying he had a choice, but God is the one doing the work. The Most Reluctant Convert, which is what he describes himself as, is a movie made several years ago, a very good one, now showing on Amazon Prime. And this is when he says God is God. You must picture me alone in that room in Magdalen, night after night, feeling, whenever my mind lifted, even for a second from my work, the steady, unrelenting approach of him who I so earnestly desired not to meet. I mean, after the things he'd said about him in his poetry, you could understand why. That which I greatly feared had at last come upon me in the Trinity term of 1929. And scholars think it may actually have been 1930, given the rest of the timeline. I gave in and admitted that God was God and knelt and prayed, perhaps that night the most dejected and reluctant convert in all England. I did not see then what is now the most shining and obvious thing, the divine humility which will accept a convert even on such terms. The prodigal son at least walked home on his own feet. This is well known, his friendship with Tolkien, but for us as Christians, it really shows the value of Christian friendship when people listen to their friends. He met Tolkien, who was a professor at Oxford, in May of 1926. And as this is maybe the most recent, with the most up-to-date findings, Alistair McGrath, who is an English evangelical, solid citizen, his biography, C.S. Lewis, A Life. I didn't put a slide of this up here, but if you're taking notes or care to know, I think the best biography of him, though it is a little dated, is called Jack by George Sayer, S-A-Y-E-R, who knew him. And then this is the most recent. It's very readable, has a nice timeline in it, and also does have stuff from papers that were recently released. So that's Alistair McGrath. Says, Tolkien would serve as midwife for Lewis. He removed the final obstacle that stood in Lewis's path to his rediscovery of the Christian faith. Remember, he's carrying this burden of God in his life, but he hasn't yet given birth to Christ. And so he describes Tolkien as the midwife who's going to do that. On a very well-known date, for at least for these guys, 1931, September 19th, they are walking after dinner on Addison's Walk, which goes around Magdalen College. Lots of deer, really pretty. Lewis is walking with Tolkien and another friend, a guy named Hugo Dyson. And Lewis realized as he spoke to them that Christianity was a true myth. And by that he means a myth is a way of explaining reality. That's what all myths do. All cultures, all religions have myths, but what he recognized in talking to these men was this one was true.
Chris,
Yeah.
can you tell me what postprandial?
Oh, after dinner. Here's how we take that last step. But again, it's an image that if you've studied Lewis at all, you can't get out of your head. God, he feels, is pulling him. As he says, the hounds of heaven were chasing me down on this second level of a double-decker bus. Now I know very well, but hardly how the final step was taken. I was driven to Whipsnade. It's a zoo. In the sidecar, he was in his brother's motorcycle in the sidecar. He never learned to drive. I told you he was not very athletic. He wasn't very coordinated either. He didn't learn to drive. Anyway, so it was one sunny morning. I'm riding in my brother's motorcycle. When we set out, I did not believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. And when we reached the zoo, I did. And I think, and this is certainly the way my faith has developed. It's different for different people. But it may start in your head, but then there is a time when your head can't do all the work. And the Spirit enters you and you realize, yes, this is true. And he writes to his friend. There's a big fat book of correspondence with his friend Arthur Greaves. And so a couple days later he says, I've just passed on from believing in God. And they stand together as the letters between the two. I have just passed on from believing in God to definitely believing in Christ, in Christianity. I will try to explain another time, but here's the important part. My long night talk with Dyson and Tolkien had a good deal to do with it. The first thing he writes afterwards is a take on Pilgrim's Progress. It is an allegory, although we describe it as an autobiographical one. It is the story of how he got to where he got as a Christian. He calls it the Pilgrim's Regress because, as he says, he had to unlearn many of the things that he had learned previously. He wasn't starting with a clean slate. He was starting from a committed unbelief. And so, along with Surprised by Joy, which I have mentioned, and A Grief Observed, which we will close with, those are the things that he has written about himself. And it's in the form of an allegory. Who's read Pilgrim's Progress? I think it was until Gone with the Wind, maybe the most, and the Bible, the most widely purchased book. But he has characters like John Bunyan does in Pilgrim's Progress. He calls them Mr. Enlightenment, which of course reflects his time as a logical unbeliever. Mr. Mammon, the temptation of wealth. Mr. Sensible, sensible people don't believe in miracles. And Mr. Humanist, meaning, we can all just get along. We don't need God to do that. So he takes those, he invents those characters to write about himself. This was also very important. And Charlotte will vouch for our family. We do nothing, because of me, I think, we do nothing halfway. If we're going to go to Lewis's Oxford, we're going to get the C.S. Lewis Institute's walking guide to Lewis's Oxford. We are going to visit the kilns, the painting that's being passed around. We, of course, had to go here, the Eagle and Child Pub, because this was also a major factor in his writing life. And there is an issue of Christian History magazine devoted to C.S. Lewis, and it says this about the Inklings. That was a name of a literary society at Oxford that these guys adopted as their own. Without doubt, Lewis's creative and theological genius was stimulated by his weekly meetings with the Inklings, a collection of thinkers and friends who gathered regularly to critique each other's writing and to discuss current events and life in general. They did. They would read, Tolkien would read from, Lord of the Rings. Lewis didn't really care for it that much, I don't think. And Lewis would read from his stuff, and they would openly critique each other. The group included Lewis, his brother Warren, Tolkien, a physician, Dr. Havard, and a fellow named Charles Williams. And I thought this is, they met in Lewis's rooms on a Thursday night at Oxford. Tuesday mornings, which I think becomes lunch, they gathered at the Eagle and Child Pub, known to them as the Bird and Baby. And they did that until Lewis died. So they sat around drinking beer and smoking heavily, which they did. Lewis did, anyway. In 1940, he writes one of his better-known works, The Problem of Pain. It is his effort to try to solve this problem. If God were good, he would wish to make his creatures perfectly happy. And if God were almighty, he would be able to do what he wished. But the creatures are not happy. Therefore, God lacks either goodness or power or both. I mean, that is the major, when we talked about evil and suffering in the theological apologetics part of this class, I said that's the biggest impediment to people. And so he answers in this very summary way for today that there is suffering because of our original bad decision and our continuing bad decisions. The fall, free will, God lets us do as we please, which he hopes will please him, but understands that it may not. And it often leads to suffering. In fact, I think in the early class we talked about the large majority of suffering is people messing up. Either yourself or somebody else has messed up. And he then says, and pain does have a purpose. God can use it. And in one of the movies about Lewis's life, it kind of juxtaposes this against the time when he will experience severe pain and suffering. He's already had it pretty tough with his mom and dad, the war, but it's going to get worse. And this is kind of an academic answer to the question. It says, God can use pain as a megaphone to rouse a deaf world. That quote is juxtaposed against his experience later in life, where he's really suffering. A way to awaken spiritual awareness and draw individuals closer to him. We are drawn to help people, we hope, when we hear that they are suffering and in pain. It can also cause that person to dig deeper into their spiritual resources. And he says, as we concluded in our study, there's really no philosophical or theoretical answer. The only answer is that Jesus, what he did for us, the pain he experienced for us, becoming one of us so that we could relate to him completely. He says, really, you can't talk about the problem of pain without focusing on the incarnation of Jesus. This, you probably know, is where the book Mere Christianity comes from. It's his most famous work. In 1940, the British are being bombed into oblivion. The Germans think they are, but the British are holding up, and they're looking for ways to maintain morale. Local radio stations are not broadcasting for security reasons. There is one, the BBC is national. That remains on the air. And they had different voices to make people feel better about what's going on. They had a voice of gardening and a voice of medicine. They had a doctor. They needed a voice of faith. And they turned to Lewis, who was not the most famous. He was not the Archbishop of Canterbury. He wasn't the rector at Westminster Abbey. And there's a reason for that, and I think he gets it here. He says, I gave these talks not because I am anyone in particular, but because I was asked to do so. I think they asked me chiefly for two reasons. Firstly, because I am a layman, not a clergyman, and secondly, because I had been a non-Christian for many years. It was thought that both these facts might enable me to understand the difficulties that ordinary people feel about the subject. I think he's right, saying most people listening would tend to tune out the Archbishop of Canterbury if they weren't already faithful members of the Church of England, and they could certainly relate to his experiences. Those talks become the book Mere Christianity, and here is his thesis in Mere Christianity. The reader should be warned that I offer no help to anyone who is hesitating between Christian denominations. You will not learn from me whether you ought to be an Anglican, a Methodist, Presbyterian, Roman Catholic. In this book, I am not trying to convert anyone to my own position, Church of England. Ever since I became a Christian, I have thought that the best, perhaps the only service I could do for my unbelieving neighbors was to explain and defend the belief that has been common to nearly all Christians at all times. That is his Mere Christianity. And what a statement of a discovered purpose for a guy that has been in 1952, he is 54 years old. And he's saying the best thing I can do is to explain and defend our beliefs. This I love as an image. He says, I hope no reader will suppose that Mere Christianity is here put forward as an alternative to the creeds of the existing communions. Not trying to start a mere Christian church, as if a man could adopt it in preference to Congregationalism or Greek Orthodoxy or anything else. It is more like a hall out of which doors open into several rooms. If I can bring anyone into that hall, I shall have done what I attempted. Just bring them into the house of Christianity. But it is in the rooms, not in the hall, that there are fires and chairs and meals. You get your nourishment and your sustenance in a denomination, in a church home. The hall is a place to wait in, a place from which to try the various doors, not a place to live in. For that purpose, the worst of the rooms is, I think, preferable. I'm not going to read this whole thing. It is what we did in our early apologetics study. It is from Mere Christianity, his argument that Jesus, one, claimed to be God. Therefore, he either was God, he was a deceiver, or he was a lunatic. People try to say, oh, but he was a great moral teacher. Well, you can't have that and have him be anything but God, because that would be deceiving. You can't be a deceitful good moral teacher. You're certainly not a lunatic if you're regarded as a good moral teacher. So he says, either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool, you can spit at him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. But let us not come with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He has not left that open to us. He did not intend to. And then, since you were piqued by this notion of the atonement, this is what he says about that. And that's, a plug. The Blanton, starting the end of August, is having an exhibition that includes my favorite, El Greco and Vasquez, some paintings. So I put El Greco up there. The central Christian belief is that Christ's death has somehow put us right with God and given us a fresh start. We hear that every Sunday in the assurance of pardon, this fresh start. Somehow Jesus did that. Theories as to how it did this are another matter. A good many different theories have been held as to how it works. You have to come back in the fall to hear about those. What all Christians are agreed upon is that it does work. We are told that Christ, remember, mere Christianity. We're not getting into the detailed differences in doctrine. We are told that Christ was killed for us, that his death has washed out our sins, and that by dying he disabled death itself. That is the formula. That is Christianity. That is what has to be believed. Any theories we build up as to how Christ's death did all this are, in my view, quite secondary. Having read that, we're going to get to what I think is the best description of the atonement that I've ever seen. And it's not a theory. It is a gut-wrenching exclamation by Lewis, and we'll see it. The Screwtape letters, the place where I got started with Lewis. He's sitting in church one day and he writes to Warren, I had this great idea that people hear enough Christian advice from Christians. What they need is to read the other point of view. What is it that the devil wants in order to win us to him? So it was the hardest thing he's ever written because he had to get in the mud to think like that. And though it's written during World War II, he's not writing of Hitler or Mussolini. Well, these are really bad people, because people can't identify with that. Well, I'm not Hitler, I'm not Mussolini. But he writes about ordinary people beset by small worldly temptations. You cannot read that and not find at least one of the letters that says, oh, that's me. And here's the cast of characters. Screwtape is undersecretary to the devil. Lewis saw hell as a large bureaucracy. And those who have dealt with large bureaucracies would say, this is hell. And Lewis would say, you're right. And in the letters, he refers to our father, Screwtape refers to our father as the devil. The enemy is God. Wormwood is Screwtape's nephew up on earth, and he is a junior tempter. He is a recruiter for the devil. And the patient is a man, a particular man, but any man. That is a wonderful, it was at the, I think it's been here more than once at the Paramount. Max McLean acts out the Screwtape letters. That's Max there. And this is kind of the essence of the Screwtape letters. Screwtape's writing to his nephew, you will say that these are all very small sins. And doubtless, like all young tempters, you're anxious to be able to report spectacular wickedness. But do remember, the only thing that matters is the extent to which you separate the man from the enemy. It does not matter how small the sins are, provided that their cumulative effect is to edge the man away from the light and out into the nothing. Murder is no better than cards if cards can do the trick. Indeed, the safest road to hell is the gradual one, the gentle slope, soft underfoot, without sudden turnings, without milestones, without signposts. That is the fascinating thing about our ministry to inmates. They've had the warning signs. They've had the signposts. They know. And where it's more folks like us that don't see where we're going. You may have read these are both what we call theological fantasies. You've got the worker for the devil, right? And here's the great divorce. A busload of the damned take an excursion to heaven, but they all choose to go back because they want to have their way. Well, this is my right. They all claim their rights, and for different people it's different things, but there's always something they insist on keeping, even at the price of misery. Lewis quotes Milton, better to reign in hell than to serve in heaven. I'd rather be in charge. And Lewis writes, there are only two kinds of people in the end, those who say to God, thy will be done, and those to whom God says, thy will be done. All that are in hell choose it. This was one of the things that probably antagonized his Oxford colleagues. He was on the cover of Time magazine. You can see the devil over there, Screwtape. Letters are being referred to. The same year he wrote a book about miracles. explaining them. The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Can't ignore this. And Lewis wrote, what we want is not more little books about Christianity, but more little books by Christians on other subjects with their Christianity latent. All right. I'm going to read this and you're going to say, oh, really? You have these siblings that have been taken out of London during the Blitz, living in a big house like he had as a child. They're exploring. And one of them goes through the wardrobe and finds this magical land of Narnia. That would be Lucy. She tells her siblings about it. Come on, that's a great story. Edmund, her brother, experiences it as well. And she goes, we got to tell Peter and Edmund, Peter and Susan about it. And he goes, oh, she's just making it up. Little liar. So they go to the professor whose house this is. When Peter and Susan think there's something wrong with Lucy in light of her reports about Narnia. Logic, said the professor half to himself. Why don't they teach logic at these schools? There are only 3 possibilities. Either your sister is telling lies, or she is mad, or she is telling the truth. You know she doesn't tell lies, and it is obvious that she's not mad. For the moment then, and unless any further evidence turns up, we must assume she's telling the truth. Where have you heard that? That's mere Christianity in a children's book. And here we go. This is the best looking picture you'll ever see of Joy Davidman. She has a terrible taste in eyewear, we'll see. Mrs. Moore, who Lewis had lived with until she dies in 1951, is dead. She dies in 51. The year before that, an American woman, Joy Davidman, who had been taken by, she was Jewish by ethnicity. She politically is a communist. She and her husband are both active communists. But she's starting to read The Great Divorce, Miracles, the Screwtape letters, and becomes a Christian. They have 2 sons. The marriage was not a good one. He was prone to depression and alcoholism, and he was also a womanizer. He's going to leave her for her cousin eventually. And see, I told you about her eyewear. Those are the 2 boys, David and Douglas. If you see the movie Shadowlands, one of them gets left out. It's just too much. I mean, they didn't dislike him. It just didn't fit the script. So she goes to England, as Douglas says in 1998. She went there to seduce Lewis. That may be a little strong, but she just comes out of the blue and is going to meet him come hell or high water. She started writing to him, then she actually does get to meet with him in Oxford. And as it's described by McGrath in his biography, Davidman made all the moves in the developing relationship. Lewis, however, seemed happy to go along with things. Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the way he was. Remember, he said, I was used to things not working and this didn't work. Well, this is working, I guess. And she comes back here, divorces her husband, comes back to England. Her immigration documents say, yeah, but you can't work over here. You can visit. And there's a limit on how long you can visit. Lewis is probably paying her expenses and her children's. Her permission to reside in the UK was about to expire. So, being a decent guy, he calls it merely a legal formality, he marries her so that she can stay. They didn't live together, but in October of '56, she broke her femur and x-rays revealed metastatic breast cancer. She's going to die. He's going to decide that he really does love her and want to marry her in a Christian ceremony. But he can't find anybody to do it because the Church of England will not marry him to someone who is divorced. But he finds a former student, cajoles him, really pressures him into doing it. The service takes place in the hospital. The pastor lays hands on her and prays for healing. She does go into remission for 3 years. And they have a life together. They live at the Kilns. She was they took her home to die. But she didn't. They went on a belated honeymoon, went to places he'd never been outside of the British Isles other than the trenches in France. So he goes to Greece and other classical sites. The cancer returns and she dies. He writes a series of notes, and so these are like in little short paragraphs, about what he is experiencing after her death. The main point was, God, my brother and I were really happy smoking our pipes and reading our books in this beautiful little house. And then you put this lady in my life. And then you take her. He's not happy. He says, not that I think I'm in much danger of ceasing to believe in God. The real danger is of coming to believe such dreadful things about him. The conclusion I dread is not so there's no God after all, but so this is what God is really like. Deceive yourself no longer. This is a great line. What do people mean when they say, I am not afraid of God because I know he is good? Have they never been to a dentist? and this, I unfortunately read in a public place. I was on an airplane and I broke down. I admit it. This is what I think the atonement is all about. He says, yet this is unendurable. Yet then one babbles, if only I could bear it, or the worst of it, or any of it instead of her. Haven't we all felt that about somebody we love? But one can't tell how serious that bid is, for nothing is staked on it. It's not going to happen. You can't take their place. If it suddenly became a real possibility, then for the first time we should discover how seriously we had meant it. Okay, you can die instead of them. But is it ever allowed? It was allowed to one, we are told. And I find I can now believe again that he has done vicariously whatever can be so done. He replies to our babble, you cannot and you dare not. I could and dared. This is a book you must read. Lewis dies on November 22nd, 1963, kind of a bad day, right? Kennedy's assassinated. You probably don't know about Aldous Huxley, but if you've read Brave New World, you know about Aldous Huxley. He dies. Lewis dies. Peter Kraft, a professor at Boston College, writes this trialogue between the three of them. They meet on the day they have gone somewhere after death. Kennedy argues the humanist position. Huxley, who was an Eastern pantheist of the Eastern religions, he argues that position. Lewis is arguing the Christian position. And they have a great dialogue or trialogue between Heaven and Hell by Peter Kraft. And there, friends, we were there last summer, he's buried at his church in Oxford. But he does have a memorial stone in Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey, and there it is. And so we will end happily, way to go, with the quote that is on there. I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. The end.